Good morning. I am Rob Curley. I am the editor of the Spokesman-Review, and this is another one of our virtual Northwest Passages community forums. Today is going to be fantastic. There's so many questions I have for our panel, and I just can't wait to, mostly Jeopardy questions, so I hope you all have practiced. So on the panel today, we have Thayne McCulloh from Gonzaga. Notice I pronounced that if you're a broadcast journalist. KirK Schulz from Washington State, Mary Cullinan from Eastern Washington, and Beck Taylor from Whitworth. Thank you all for being here. I just have so many questions for you all, so thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question here. So I've always kind of felt like, as a journalist, when we talk to people in your positions, that higher ed always has really decent backup plans for so many different emergency situations. But you also kind of play it by the odds. And my guess is that the odds were pretty low for pandemic that shuts down the world. So I'm curious, before we get started, what did you all have plans for something so devastating like this?
Hey, Rob, Beck Taylor here. I'll take that first. I think as all of our campuses do well, as you said, we do place a priority on the health, welfare, and safety of our students. And so our campuses have been practiced for a long time and thinking about various scenarios that impact that welfare. And going back to the late 2000s, 2008, 9, you'll recall we had a pandemic scare then, and I think that was probably the first shot across the bow in modern times for higher education. But as we thought about that particular crisis then, and as we prepared for a future crisis in the public health realm, we probably weren't contending or thinking about something as widely spread as this, as global as this, and as long lasting as this. And so I think for those of us who have planned for these kinds of things in terms of technology solutions, public health, for those of us all of us are residential campuses, the complexity of this, the size and scope of this particular crisis, I think have outstripped, I'll speak for myself and my campus, have outstripped all of our expectations in planning.
Yeah, this is
Mary.
KirK.
Yeah, go ahead, KirK.
Yeah, no, KirK from WSU. I would say the answer to that is no. We do lots of contingency planning for different things. And I think most of the time, most of our planning was around some sort of violence on campus, those types of things. And I think, to be honest, generally, that's why we did most of our planning was a little bit around risk management and what types of things we thought were most likely to occur. And when I'm with presidents from other areas in the country, I'll say, I'll bet you don't have something about a volcano erupting in your state as, part of your history and tradition at your university. And to me, this is a little bit like something like that. It's going to happen once every 100 years. It's the type of thing that I think you have some planning and some people around, but you also got to use some flexibility in the fact that all of us as presidents have fantastic leadership teams and really bright, smart people on our campuses. And in times are good, you need great leaders, but when times are tough is when you really, really value the people that we have around us. And we've been proud of our folks for stepping up in a very short period of time. And I think higher education as a whole, public and private, really deserve a lot of kudos for the way our faculty shifted so quickly and put students first. And we're often described as a profession that everything happens in, glacial speeds. This was one where, some places over a weekend went from in-person to distance and not just did it, but did it well. And I think that's something to be proud of.
Yeah. Mary?
I'll echo KirK because so I was in California my campus was hit by the Loma Prieta earthquake. I was in Texas when we had a couple of pretty major hurricanes, Katrina and Rita. And then I was president in Oregon when we had the global recession. I think I've gotten on the wrong side of the higher ed deities somehow. But this was unparalleled because it's not like the flu planning that we've done in the past. We always figured, yes, this is what we would do. We have a great crisis management team, and as KirK said, great leadership. But we did the same thing over spring break. 12,000 students, all these hundreds of faculty turned the whole place onto an online institution. And also all the support services for our students who were suddenly stranded, some of them without computers, who were trying to figure out how they could get their education in this new online world, and all the support for mental health and library access and everything. I have never seen campuses respond the way ours did in such a short period. And now we're in it for the long term, and that's another whole struggle that we're going to have to face as we look. This isn't going away right away, which is another whole challenge.
Thayne?
All that my colleagues have said, I would agree with. What I would add is I would tend to say, no, we have not planned for this, in part because of the enormity of its scope. We tend to plan for disasters of all kinds, but we make some assumptions about the degree of control we will have or will be able to assert. This is kind of like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. It's just worldwide. And there are decisions being made for us by an awful lot of people who are making decisions for everybody else as well. So part of the challenge associated with the situation is that we have far less agency in this circumstance beyond the immediate reaction of largely evacuating and doing some transformational work. But we're sitting right alongside so many other enterprises, industries, businesses, watching things come apart and wondering about what the longer term effects of the economic meltdown, for example, are going to be on students' ability to pay or families' ability to support education for their sons and daughters and family members. So there's a lot that feels very sort of out of our control. I think all of our institutions did use the H1N1 issue as at least an opportunity. At the time, we were anticipating having to manage that, and that allowed us to develop certain systems and infrastructures in some cases that we have now really come to rely on. So it isn't without some early premonition, but the scale and the scope of this it's breathtaking.
Yeah. Well, I would like to switch a little bit over to the fall term, and I'd like for all four of you to kind of talk a little bit about this. What might that fall term look like? Do we have any ideas, or if you were just your best thoughts at this exact moment?
Well, I could start because we've just laid out a plan for the campus. So our plan is to assume that we will be fully online in the fall. And then if we need to pivot, we can. But the first plan, now that we have a number of months, is to do a really, really good job to have as many classes as possible online. And then look at the areas where we can't be. We have a dental hygiene program, the labs that really have to be in person. We'll set up protocols to keep small groups and with the proper safety precautions, and clean the buildings, etc. And if in an amazing world that suddenly this whole thing goes away, we could pivot back to face-to-face. But that would be a lot simpler than having to start out face-to-face and pivot to online in the middle of October or November. So we're planning to, we figure if we go figure on online for the fall, there's a higher percentage of chance that we could be face to face in winter and spring, and that would be fantastic.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to go next.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're envisioning, we're taking a little different approach than Mary and Eastern is. We're planning on in-person operations across all of our campuses. And what that's going to look like, though, is not what people left, shall we say, in March. We're on a semester system before spring break where people just congregated together, things like that. So some of what we're thinking about is social distancing is going to be critical. We will mandate social distancing on all campus activities of any type, whether it's instruction, the student union, um, you know, class gatherings, social functions, Greek life, all of that. Social distancing is going to be the norm. The second thing that's really critical for us is we want to use our creative energy. So, for example, maybe instead of a 400-person class in something, what we would do is do some part of that online and flip the classroom where we would do small study sections that maybe had 20 to 25 people in each one, but we put that study section in a room that can seat 200, and then we mandate some social distancing between there. We look at things like Saturday and Sunday time frames, early morning and evenings for classes to make better use of the facilities that we have to maintain social distancing. So we're starting to put some of that together on what that's going to look like. And we've been pretty aggressive about telling families, parents, returning students that we're planning on that in-person experience, but it's going to look a little different. We like to say it's still going to be a KirK experience, but it's going to be a different KirK experience than people might have had before. Now, as soon as you do that, people are like, well, what about X? What about Y? What about Z? And I'll go back to the same thing Mary's talking about. I want to remind folks, we still have the entire month of May, entire month of June, entire month of July, and we would have people coming back in mid-August. And so everybody's trying to use what we know today and extrapolate out 2.5 to 3 months. And if I look at where we were a month ago and where we are today, it's even much different. And actually things look better now than they did a month ago. So I just want to remind people watching or hearing or listening, things are changing rapidly. We have some of the best minds in the nation, in our state, that are working on how to stand higher ed in business, in industry, in restaurants, and things back up so we get our economy going again.
Yeah, thanks, KirK. I would just echo a lot of what KirK said. Let me underscore this before I talk about Whitworth's approach and posture for the fall. The appetite that our publics, our constituents at the university have for our resolution of uncertainty will satiate much quicker, much less quickly than we can actually come up with the answers to the questions that people have. And so it is appropriate and understandable that our incoming and returning students will want to know what the fall will look like sooner than we will know all the answers to those questions. And I think what I'm hearing from both Mary and KirK is that we want to be honest with our constituencies and acknowledge that uncertainty, but we also want to, given our own individual contexts and our own understandings of the current reality and the plausible states of the world, what our best approach will be for the fall. And like WSU, Whitworth has signaled to our constituents that we are planning for an in-person residential experience in the fall, but with all of the caveats that KirK has mentioned appropriately: social distancing, using creativity around education in all kinds of formats. Fortunately, at Whitworth, we already have small classes. And so the few large section classes that we have, we'll certainly think about creative solutions for those things. But we're already at Whitworth a relatively small learning community. And so perhaps some of those adjustment factors might be a little bit easier for us than they would for a large state institution. And then the last thing I would just mention is, I think all of us benefit from either a semi-suburban, suburban, or rural context. And that's very different from some of our colleagues on the western side of the state. And so it may be that we are able to do some things here in Eastern Washington that aren't as feasible on the I-5 corridor. And so as we are advising the governor and helping his team make good decisions for the entire state, I think it's important for us as Eastern Washington colleagues to impress upon the governor the importance of regional differences and contextual differences as well. And so those would be just some of the things we're thinking about for the fall.
Yeah, for my part, I guess what I would share is we early on said that we feel that it would be best for us to plan with a view towards reopening and resuming in-class instruction, face-to-face instruction for the fall. But we did that in part because I feel that we need to have objectives to plan to and not waste a lot of time cogitating about what it is that our best intentions are, or what our options are, and so forth. So if we can set a horizon for people and give them goals and objectives to plan to, we'll get a lot further down the road of imagining where the challenges to actualizing that are going to be. And I would just say that on the basis of initial conversations with colleagues here, we are very aware and very realistic about the fact that those challenges are there and they're real, and some of them are concerning. So let me just say that while we all desperately want to see the resumption of our work occur, and we all want to provide the educational programs for which we are known and which we believe are responsive to the medium and longer term needs of society, we also recognize we have a fundamental responsibility to do this work prudently and thoughtfully, because I will tell you that there is no scenario that we are developing that does not contemplate the infection of our students. And so it's important to me that the public be aware and know that every one of us is sitting here saying, right, on the one hand, this is the ideal, but in every circumstance, we have to have backups and contingency plans in place. And when, for example, KirK, as he mentioned, the use of social distancing, one of the impositions that exists for us, and the concerns that I think we all have, is about personal protective equipment and its availability. We all have heard throughout the course of this pandemic that one of the challenges is access for our medical care providers to basic equipment that allows them to do their jobs safely and allows them to protect the patients. Well, analogously, that's our circumstance on campus too. So there are all kinds of issues that we're teeing up and we're identifying that I think it's important for people to be aware are very much on our minds, because we care about our communities, and our communities interact with the students that we bring to those communities, and we feel a deep sense of responsibility for all of that.
And I just want to add too that building on what Thayne just said, this is what makes our university so different from other institutions, like this other state institutions, like the DMV, that could say, well, we'll let one person in the building at a time. You know, we can't do that. We have lifted our live-on requirement for freshmen for fall, in case students want to stay home or their families want them to stay home. But we are keeping our res halls open, and students can come in single room only, and we will clean those rooms every day, sanitize them. So one of the major uncertainties is how many students want to come back and live on a campus in the fall. I'm hearing from students that don't want to stay at home anymore. I'm hearing from families that don't want to send their child to a residence hall. We have all kinds of issues. We have faculty who feel unsafe because of their physical situations or their age. And so there are thousands of different variables here that we're looking at, and it's a conundrum, certainly beyond anything probably that we've really seen in our experiences.
You know, and you've hit a big point here, is the uncertainty is so far reaching and on so many different levels. I'd like to have each of you kind of talk a little about that. KirK, could you talk about what is one of the biggest uncertainties that's kind of in the forefront of your mind right
now? Intercollegiate athletics, no question. I'm asked that more often than not. People are like, oh yeah, we want to know about coronavirus. Are the Cougs going to be playing football this fall in front of a full stadium? And that's probably one of the things that I just have to say, we don't know. Our first priority is around instruction and making sure that we have that right environment. And parallel to that, we're clearly thinking about what we're going to do. But it's not just even football, it's also gatherings on campus. And we do lectures, and we've got this, all of us have this academic culture that's part of our particular institutions. And how do you preserve some parts of that people come to expect? That's what they pay for. It's not just the content delivery in the classes. I would say education is a more holistic experience that each of us offers something a little bit different. That would be the thing that keeps coming up. And my answer is going to continue to dissatisfy folks by saying we don't know yet what that's going to look like, and we're just going to continue to work at it. And I'm going to watch professional sports. Major League Baseball's talked about maybe starting to play near the end of June. I think there's going to be some other groups and organizations out there that we can model. It's not going to be exactly the same thing that all of us have on our campuses, but there are going to be other things going out. For example, and Boeing, Boeing went back on their production lines, and they put in place a series of different things. Now, all those may not be applicable to higher ed, but a month from now, we're going to have some pretty good data from Boeing and how that's worked on their assembly lines, what things has functioned well, what things hasn't. So again, the uncertainty, and I think Beck mentioned this, the uncertainty, people just want definitive answers when there are none to give. And as leaders, we operate in an uncertain environment most of the time. And we just got to continue to reassure our constituents, our faculty, staff, students, parents, alumni, the state, that it's going to be okay for it to be a little bit squishy out there, and we're just going to continue to be flexible.
Beck, what's one of your uncertainties?
Yeah, I would elevate the social psychology of all of this, and it really feeds right into what KirK was talking about. We are not contemplating a future that looks anything close to what normal looked like before this pandemic began. I think you're hearing a common theme. We, of course, have goals and hopes and aspirations that we can get as close to that missional point of education that each of us has and holds and elevates. But this is an exercise in risk management. And at the end of the day, I am curious as a social scientist, but even more invested as a president of a university, to know exactly how are our students, how are their families, how are our communities going to manage risk in the fall. As Thayne said, we are not imagining a scenario in the fall in which we do not have infected students. We are trying to take every precaution and understand this virus from an epidemiological and biological and medical standpoint to understand what are appropriate risks and what are inappropriate risks. But how our communities deal with constant testing, frequent isolations, maybe the need and ability to move in and out of hybrid, in-person, online education as needed, and whether or not our students and their families and our community can tolerate that kind of dynamic is something that I just have a big question mark around. I think for those of us who are planning on in-person instruction and residential campuses in the fall, I think there's a state of the world we'd like to think of in which students and their families can manage that risk appropriately and be flexible and grace-filled as our community is trying to kind of deal with this. But as you know, our society hasn't yet shown, I think, a propensity to manage this risk in particularly rational ways. And so it'll be just kind of interesting to see if 4 months from now, we're able to manage that risk or internalize that risk or express that risk in any different ways than we are today.
Thayne, what uncertainty is bothering you or worrying you the most? Oh, Thayne,
Sorry, yeah, I got it. I guess what I would say is at its core, for me, the greatest concerns and the greatest uncertainty still live in the fundamental space of disease management. Until we have a vaccine and until we have reliable, effective intervention strategies where there's promising developments that are apparently on the horizon, but they await mass manufacturing, they await development and testing. We're going to be living in a very difficult and challenging time. And I think that one thing that we're all very conscious of is that it points directly at what Beck was sharing about the social psychology of this in a particular expression. We work on our campuses to a large degree with a population of individuals who, especially after a period of time, become very comfortable in their environment, and they become very experimental in that environment. And so some of the natural tendencies of our students to want to explore and to develop relationships and to recreate and all of the kinds of things that typify the college experience run to a certain degree diametrically opposite to the kinds of conventions that everybody is being enjoined to adopt. And so particularly if we find ourselves in a circumstance where I think many Spokaneites find themselves, where there are still mass numbers of people who actually don't know a single person personally who has contracted this virus, which is very dissimilar from other, communities around the country. Similarly, if that occurs on our campus, people will become more and more comfortable. But the truth of the matter is there are any number of vectors that are intersecting with our students and with our faculty and staff on an ongoing basis that are coming from outside of our communities. And we can't see any of that activity, right? Often based on the current technology and the current capabilities, we have real limitations in terms of detection and even the equipment necessary to observe this. So for me, it's about the epidemiology and it's about the management of the phenomenon and trying to work our planning in the face of all of that dynamic. It's going to be interesting.
Mary, what are you worried about when it comes to uncertainty?
Well, first of all, one of the wonderful things about an academic year is its certainty. So you start off with freshman orientation and welcoming and convocation and homecoming, and you move through the terms, final exams, end with commencement, and there's a rhythm, and that rhythm has been incredibly disrupted. And so the first thing that we did was move exam week. So we moved it up a week earlier, made the exams at the end of winter term all online, added a week to spring break so that people could get their classes online. And then we're having virtual commencements. People are blown away by all that change. And And now they're going, they want to know what's going to happen in summer. They want to know what's going to happen in fall. They want to know if football is going forward. And so the rhythm of the academic year is disrupted, and the certainties of the academic year are disrupted. I mean, the number of emails I've gotten about commencement, please let us walk across the stage. And you can't bring 10,000 people together. You just can't. And so there's just a lot of disappointment in that. And we're trying to build a fall that's full of adventure and fun and all of the things that KirK talked about that go along with education, but assume that no, we're not going to have our big mass events at the opening of the year. And that is going to be hard for a lot of people. It's very uncertain. And then we don't know. People will say, well, what happens if you have a death? We don't know. How are we, it's all going to be based on how this all happens. We haven't yet had a case diagnosed, and I cross all my fingers, but I don't know that that's going to be maintained. And then what are we going to do? And we have to create scenarios for every one of these possibilities, and also keep people engaged.
It's interesting because one of the uncertainties that I just was so positive I'd hear from all of you, and I didn't hear from any of you, so I'm bringing it up, is the financial uncertainties. And KirK, I'd like to start with you. One of the largest institutions in our state, but you get a fair amount of funding from the state. What are your uncertainties? Do you know anything? Have you heard anything? Will it be more funding, less funding? How is that all going to play out in Pullman?
Yeah, well, the more funding thing means that I wake up because that's only going to be a dream. I think we have a couple things. One, there's a lot of families out there that talked about the need for reimbursement, things like that. We're like a lot of folks, we elected to reimburse families for housing and dining dollars where they were staying at home and things like that. As a semester system, for us, we had already gotten through 9 in-person weeks. So we're only talking about 6 weeks, but it's still something like $13 million that we sent back appropriately to families and things like that. And, we have a lot of people employed in housing and dining and student services and things like that are really dependent on students and people being here. So we have some uncertainty in that particular space. We don't know what the impacts are going to be on the state of Washington's budget. And we do anticipate that there'll be some rescission or cut that the state will need to impose just because tax revenues have tanked at the state level. But, we've heard some wild numbers, which I'm not going to repeat because there's no basis in fact to them. So what we're just trying to tell people is we did the same things everybody else here did, hiring freezes and minimization of travel and just being really careful. But we're going to start doing some more solid contingency planning in the next couple months as things start to shape up. So we anticipate that one will sort of see reduced revenues from the state. And there's been a lot of speculation out there about enrollments in the fall. And as I'm going to tell our campus community in a letter I'm going to send out tomorrow, we just need to be a little careful about where we're taking that information. Some person who does research in this space located in a different region of the country that writes an editorial that says, oh, this is going to happen. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen. It's just that context does matter. So for us, we see our summer school enrollment, we believe is going to be the highest it's ever been at WSU. So everybody would have said, well, that's going to tank because people aren't going to be worried about higher education. And everybody's like, how much of an enrollment decline are you going to budget for? I think we're going to be spending a lot of time this summer trying to work to hold our class that's coming in and to make sure that we're reaching out even more than we normally would to ensure those families have the financial means to pursue an education. So this may be president speak, and you say, well, KirK, you didn't really give any details. We're we're going to be doing some contingency planning. We're continuing to talk to the office of the governor, and we're going to do what we can to minimize impact to our teaching mission. But knowing that this is a pandemic and it's going to affect the state a great deal, very difficult to see what that's going to look like. Finally, I will say, for those of us at public universities, Washington has been blessed with a legislature and a governor that value public higher education and have invested in our institutions, our campuses, our faculty and staff. And while we may take a momentary step back in terms of some finances, the philosophy of the state of Washington that we're important and we're important to a growing economy is maybe more important in the long run than other states that see education or higher education as a tax on the budget. That, boy, if we didn't have to pay for that, just think how much money we would have. That's an important philosophical difference.
Beck, I'd like to switch over to you for this. One of the very first Northwest Passages we did virtually like this was with your education dean, Ron Jacobson, and he was fantastically informative. But he said one thing, and we didn't really dwell on it much, but he said he believes that this pandemic is going to cause some universities to close. Like, we will see education institutions that have been around for a century or more go away. Will you address that? What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. And, I think that even though our budget models and economic models are somewhat different between state institutions and private independent institutions like Gonzaga and Whitworth, many of the same laws of gravity apply. As Mary said, not only are we accustomed to this kind of rigid schedule and rhythm, our institutions are large and cumbersome, and there's a lot of inertia that goes with them. And that makes budget planning and the kind of scenario analysis that KirK mentioned very, very, very difficult. We are a tuition-driven institution, unlike, and I know Mary and KirK would say the same thing. Even though the state invests directly into those institutions, they depend largely upon tuition-paying students and families to come. We were probably a little bit more tuition dependent at a place like Whitworth. And so our campus's ability to host students in our residence halls and to run our operations are critically important for us as an economic entity. And that's obviously part of our anxiety about the fall, is whether or not we're able to host students and to house them and to teach them in the ways that we're accustomed. Some of the estimates that we have all read have indicated that sometime in the next decade, somewhere between 10 and 15% of institutions would cease to operate for economic patterns. I suspect that number is probably still true. It won't include places like Gonzaga and Whitworth on the independent side because we're strong institutions and healthy financially. But I suspect that a number of our sister institutions will, in fact, succumb to the economic pressures that this crisis, the coming economic crisis as a result of the pandemic, and the demographic cliff that we're all expecting as well in the middle part of this decade. I suspect we're going to see that same 10 to 15% unfortunately go under, but probably a lot faster than in the next decade. We're already seeing some closures being announced, which is sad and unfortunate for those communities. So I do think that this is going to place a real stress on the economic models of small to mid-sized private and independent colleges. And I think a few of them are going to succumb to those pressures, unfortunately. And I think it's something that we're all concerned about, particularly as tuition-driven institutions.
Thayne, I'd like to move to you. I have a question. We've gotten so many great questions from our readers. I mean, they are coming in and they are so strong. One question that from Jen: do you see the role of education changing with and after the COVID pandemic? I mean, what will the effects on this be on what education and forces every part look like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because, we know this instinctively, inherently, by virtue of the fact that the first order of business post COVID-19 is going to be a massive recovery effort. And no small part of that is going to be beginning the process of paying back all the money that we just borrowed from the future. And the way that that gets expressed is in diminishment of government support for various types of activities in the interests of supporting those that are considered primary. And so I absolutely think that this is going to be a forcing function that demands responses from all kinds of institutions in various ways. And what it's also going to do is it's going to compel us to consider deeply the question of how it is that our higher ed institutions can collaborate and can really work together to decrease the duplication of programs, because the truth is that a lot of our institutions, independent or private institutions, non-profit institutions, state institutions, have lived in somewhat of a free market environment where they, to a certain degree, compete with one another for, if you will, the student population of interest. And I think there's going to be such a radical shift that is going to be required to be responsive to the national needs, to the regional needs, to the industrial needs. And so, unfortunately, I do agree with Beck's assessment, and what I infer from the dean's comments. I think are a nation that invested tremendously in higher education in the 20th century. The capacity is greater than the demand, and if we don't retool, and if we don't focus on the question of what our role is in the culture, we're at great risk of becoming irrelevant, because there's tremendous opportunity post COVID-19, in my opinion. I mean, I think it's difficult to a certain degree to know exactly what that's going to be, but these kinds of crises beget all sorts of needs and challenges, and some opportunity, for actually growth and expansion will be realized here too. But I think it's absolutely going to change the role and the nature of what we do, how we do it, who we're serving, no question.
I'd like to go ahead, KirK. Yeah.
Let me maybe offer a different viewpoint. I think education is inherently a personalized process. We could all do content delivery much more efficiently using technology, and haven't been able to do that for a long time. But students come to our places, all of our places, because education is more than simply the delivery of content from person A to person B. And so while I agree with some of Thayne's comments around the immediate future is going to look different, I remember back in the 70s, people talking about the end of higher education. We're not going to need it. We have massive online courses. That was going to change higher education. We don't need residential campuses. The onset of high bandwidth connectivity is going to change higher education. We're not going to, I mean, I sort of see these 5-year, 10-year increments where everybody says we're going to be out of business. Now, have we evolved and changed? And will there be some forcing change? I agree with that. But I still think at the end of the day, what we offer is not just content. It is education in a broadest sense. And some of that is going to, I still think a couple years after COVID-19, we're going to see some return to that value of being together as people and learning from those experiences.
We've surveyed our students who are in exclusively online modes right now, and to a person, they are saying that despite the best efforts that Whitworth faculty members are putting into their classes and their peers are stepping up and learning outcomes are happening, they can't wait to return to campus. And I think in some interesting ways, the current pandemic and the isolation we're all experiencing might prove to underscore the value of the kind of interpersonal communication that KirK just underscored, and that all of our campus represented on this Zoom call today really employ as our primary means of education. And so perhaps people won't be quite as enamored by online and distance education and will want to return to more residential and in-person models.
And I'll add too, because we just surveyed our students, and one of the questions was, did they prefer the synchronous or the asynchronous approach? And overwhelmingly, they liked the synchronous approach. We thought that would not be the case, that they would like to be able to take their content, at midnight or whenever. But no, they liked the sense of being in with a community of students and having a class at 10 a.m. or whatever. And so I think one of the things that will come out of this will be just a whole lot more flexibility on the part of our institutions, on the part of our faculty and our students. Our students are now going to graduate with the skills to work in teams in an online environment, which they may not have gotten in the past. They're going to have an exceptionally strong set of skills, and our faculty are developing skills they didn't have before. And I just think we're going to have a richer academic environment by the time we get through this.
I want to get another question from a reader, and it's not to anyone. None of these have been specific to any of you. They're just asking the room. Are you prioritizing, this is from Bridget, are you prioritizing courses to consider which ones you will keep and which ones you will cut? And if it's the latter, how might that affect tenured faculty as well as students who may need a course to complete their major for graduation?
Bridget may be a faculty member in my philosophy department. I don't know. It's a really good question. And frankly, it's not a new question. Institutions of higher learning have for years been reconciling their economic and financial models to the realities of providing and delivering a very expensive education in a variety of different fields. I will say at Whitworth, we are fundamentally wedded to a liberal arts foundation. And so certainly we have to respond to some of the changing demand characteristics of our students and the ways in which our students vote with their feet into the academic disciplines that perhaps are most attractive. But as we think about paring back our resources, if we need to, if enrollment decreases require us to make cuts, we're going to be doing that in a way that prioritizes the student learning experience. Obviously, at our different institutions, certain faculty ranks and types receive various guarantees and protections, and that's probably appropriate. But I think we're going to put the students first and work within those other constraints as best we can.
Unless someone else wants to answer, we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to wrap up. We have so many reader questions. I want to get to as many as I can. KirK, can you give us an idea? This is from Rebecca. When will my freshman son know what to expect vis-a-vis the school plan for his starting year? Is there a moment when you will have an agenda or a game plan that you can send to first-year students?
Yeah, I would say your son should expect to live in a residence hall in Pullman if that's where he is going to elect to go. And I think that needs to continue to be the plan with the calendar that's laid out. Now, what we're going to do is over the course of the summer, as people go through summer orientation, we're going to continue to provide details and things like that about any changes or ways that we think we're going to operate. We're going to continue to message all summer that we want people to still continue to move forward as they would in a normal semester. And we're going to put the protections and plans in place to make sure that their students are as safe as practically possible, their faculty and staff are safe as practically possible, and to outline what those particular things are.
Do the rest of you have anything to add to that? Okay, I'm moving to the next question then. So Chad would like to know, as a group, why are your institutions giving refunds or not giving refunds to students for tuition, fees, room, and board?
We at Whitworth, as I think a couple of others have mentioned, gave refunds, prorated refunds for unused room and board. We felt like that was appropriate, and felt like that was something that could assist our families in this very difficult time. We have not given refunds for tuition, and that is simply because learning continues on our campus, and our faculty are engaged in the process of leading and mentoring our students, albeit in a different format. And if anything, this semester, my costs have actually gone up, not gone down in terms of delivering education. And so we hope that it reduces to a value proposition, and that our students and families are grateful for the flexibility that we've offered instructionally. And we've frankly not gotten a lot of demands from our constituents for refunds on tuitions or discounts on tuitions this semester, which is encouraging.
Could the rest of you hit that? Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
I'll just say we benefited from being on the quarter system. And so we could refund spring term right away because we were going fully online for spring. So we could refund the housing and dining fees, and not tuition. Again, yeah, our expenses remain strong because we're still teaching. So yes, we are not refunding tuition, but there were some fees we could return.
Thayne, what's the philosophy at Gonzaga?
Yeah, we refunded 50% of both room and board, and similar. One of the issues that I think attends, which is worthy of some conversation at another point, has to do with this the perception of the relative value of delivering the work online versus in person. There are benefits and there are limitations to all different modes of learning. And I would share with you that I really benefited all through the course of working together with our community through this semester at the observations that some of our faculty who are experienced in some cases at both working with students in the classroom and preparing and delivering courses online, that what they were obligated to do, and this is at Gonzaga, but it's across our institutions, was actually neither of those things. In some cases, what they were obligated to do was to teach in the middle of a crisis. And so all of our institutions were compelled to invest significantly in technology, in equipment, to, in some cases, provide equipment to students in order to assure the continuation of their education. And these were, to an institution, unanticipated expenses. So the sense that I think a lot of people take away is that somehow there is a greater cost effectiveness associated with delivering courses online that does not often hold true. And the tremendous amount of additional work that has been obligated on the part of colleagues to actually do this effectively, having transformed the modalities, is significant. So these are very real issues that I appreciate actually the question bringing forward, and I think they need to continue to be part of what we talk about.
And I'll just
KirK?
add too that because the thought of teaching in a crisis, our students had significant need for mental health support. They have so many obstacles and challenges in their lives anyway, and this has made it worse. But we have learned to provide that support online. And that actually is going to greatly increase our effectiveness and capacity going forward, even if we're back face to face, because the students really appreciate getting that kind of support virtually, which is good to know.
KirK, could you weigh in on this?
I'll just echo the comments my colleagues have made. One, it's not cheaper. I think that's the most important thing. Secondly, we're not dusting off some videotapes we have on the shelf, popping those in and harvesting tuition money for things like that. Our faculty are still teaching, they're still working. So there's become this this dialogue out there that somehow universities are profiting from this and that students are receiving something less than they paid for. And I just, we feel very strongly that they're continuing along their degree pathway. Our faculty are still actively teaching and putting together course materials and pivoting. We took labs, chemistry labs, and moved them to online, just like a lot of places did. So I just want to make sure that we're as strong as possible here. There is no big tuition bonus that we're all getting and sitting on by doing this. If anything, we've got unanticipated expenses to do this, but we did it because we felt it was best for our students. Now, fees and things like that, all of us have done refunds of different styles that fit our budgets and our philosophies. And sometimes people forget about that. But tuition, as long as our students can continue down the road towards graduation on time, I think it's really important that we remind people this is not a cheaper educational experience. This is simply a different delivery method than people might have anticipated 8 weeks ago.
I do. Can I
Yeah.
add one additional comment? I think we
Yeah.
all acknowledge at the same time that this has fundamentally changed the experience of our entire community. So it is not the case that this has been without consequence to the lived experience of our students and faculty and staff. There are graduating seniors who have been denied the opportunity to experience their senior year in the way that they have conventionally understood it to exist. And these are really understood through this experience of loss. So going back to the observation that has been made by my colleagues about the fundamental experiential nature of what it is that we do, it cannot be denied that the interposition of the ways in which we've been obligated to behave in this crisis have not afforded any of us the opportunity to have some of the experiences we all would have wanted and wanted to have for our students. That doesn't mean that it renders a less expensive situation for us to manage.
So I'd like to, last question, and initially you had said something, Thayne, that has been echoed by several different questions we've gotten from readers. You talked about that you have to plan for what a student infection scenario looks like across your campus. And Mary wanted to know that although classroom spaces will need to be adjusted to meet social distancing expectations, what kind of other functions does the university do for things like parking, transportation, dining halls, dorms, even that congregational moment that of passing time between classes? I mean, the middle of your campuses are a hub of life. It may be one of the most campuses are filled with this energy that it's hard to, and it's because of the students. What does all of this look like in a scenario like this? I mean, and I'd like for each of you to answer, and then we'll wrap it up for the day.
Well, I'll go first and just simply say that everything and more on that list is very much on our minds and very much the focus of our energies. Each of us has convened or will be convening task forces and subcommittees and committees that are going to be focused on very discrete aspects, all of which have to then be brought together in this sort of elegant interplay. But I think that fundamental, in my way of thinking about it, to our approach has to be the recognition that we are inviting people to assume and to share in the risk associated with doing this work. To a certain degree, the approach that Mary and Eastern Washington University are taking initially, it is a stake in the ground around how it is that you attempt to work into this situation and minimize risk. And so we're all going to be, I think, working together to think about ways that we give agency in no small part to our students and our faculty and staff, so that people can be agents, active agents in helping each other and themselves to manage the situation. But there's no question that engaging in any of these activities carries with it the potential for real risk, and the need to be very upfront about what those risks are and what our capabilities are in terms of helping people to work with them at this point in time. That will evolve, but that's certainly very much at the forefront of our minds.
And I would just echo Thayne's remarks. This is why I brought up the social psychology of all of this earlier. I think that in some ways, those of us who are at least planning for in-person residential experiences in the fall are in fact making those plans based on the assumption that our communities will be at a very different place than they are today in terms of their ability to assess and live with an active virus in our community. Hopefully in 4 months' time, our communities will see very little transmission of this virus. But as Mary said earlier, this virus is not going away. Until we have a vaccine, this is something that we will have to contend with. And so I think the ways in which our communities can institute best practices and new conventions around these very social kinds of aspects, Rob, that you mentioned, I think is going to be critical for our success in our disease management of this. But I think that there are some very practical solutions to these problems as well. If dining halls need to be occupied at less capacity, we can go to a cruise ship type dining hour for our residents. If classrooms need to be less dense, we can certainly modify those kinds of things. And so I think there are some real solutions, but ultimately it's going to be a risk management kind of analysis, as Thayne mentioned.
And I'll just add, and I'm saying some of the same things people have already said. We have several hundred students living in our residence halls right now, people that foreign students or students who couldn't go home. And so we're learning a lot of the protocols that we'll have in place for the fall. And the students who are coming back in the fall are going to have learned a lot. I mean, the seniors in high school have had a different experience than any other senior class that we've ever seen. And we're going to be putting in a lot of things into place that we've never seen before, but we're learning fast and thinking through these things. And the safety, the health of our faculty, staff, students, and community are the number one priority. And we're looking at every way to ensure that we support that in every way possible.
KirK?
I would just remind the folks that are watching and listening that we still have multiple months. And I think it's easy to be at home or in our office by ourselves. And what we see today, we want to just extrapolate out to August. As cities open up around the country, as states open up, as people do that, we've still got a lot of information that we're going to be able to glean from industry, restaurants, different types of things opening back up, and what works and what doesn't. As an example, maybe we find out in another 6 weeks that everybody's going to have to wear masks for the conceivable future when they're out and about. And that's not just to go into Costco, but it could be that's the type of thing on our campuses that we're going to need to do, not to eliminate something, but to mitigate it. So I just, I try and remind our leadership team here that we need to continue to look forward. We got to be planning, but we also have the benefit of in our businesses of several more months of data, information, and trials that people are using around the country. And as long as we share information, if something doesn't work, we're not going to do that. If something does work well, that'll be part of our strategy moving forward.
This has just been fascinating and so thoughtful, and I can't believe how many questions you all answered and how thoroughly you answered them. It's like you get paid to speak or something. So you know, I want to thank you all, and please, I hope we can. It doesn't take a pandemic for all of us to get together again to have one of these conversations, because education is so important for our communities. So thank you all. And you know, later today this is a little bit of a pitch. So later today, we're going to have on Kathy Morris Rogers to answer your questions. On Thursday, we have Spokane County Health Officer Dr. Lutz, which is going to be really fascinating. And Northwest Passages started as a glorified book club, and we're finally bringing back authors starting this Friday with SM Holson. We have a bunch of others planned. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that we never charge for these, and we always want to make it so that this is for the community good. So in the spirit of giving, today is Giving Tuesday, and if any of you have money, you should donate to your universities and any charities that you feel strongly about. But I would also lobby that you should donate to Northwest Passages, which you can on the Inovia's website or at spokesman.com/thanks. So we're going to be doing a lot more of these. And like I said, thank you all so much. I really, really, really hope that we can do this again in less stressful time.
Support local journalism.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Yeah,
I appreciate it. Thank you all, and have a good and safe day out there. Okay.
Thank
God
you so
bless.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.